I want people to know that this is not just because of things that happened in the past. These are things that are happening right now.
Tonight, underfunding is a human rights violation and contributes to the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
This Frenchman, you know, just comes into the res and just showed me a different way, you know.
And building a new life in the trades without having to leave their home community. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Representatives of over 30 Indigenous advocacy groups and Canadian government institutions have gathered in Quebec City for the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They're focusing on MMIWG issues through the lens of human rights. Tom Fenario has the story.
People sort of think that Canada is this bastion of human rights and we have such a wonderful international reputation, but you know, there are human rights violations of Indigenous communities going on every day under our noses, and we're barely talking about it.
Naomi Metallic is a law professor at Dalhousie University, where she specializes in Indigenous law and human rights. Metallic has been testifying at the MMIWG expert hearings for 2 days. She says many obstacles facing Indigenous women can be attributed to one thing.
Massive underfunding of programs, which translates into people not having enough to eat, not having sufficient housing, you know, the social health and other problems that result from all of that.
But Metallic says simply increasing funds for essential services isn't the only answer. She says there needs to be long-term consistency that is impervious to political change.
You cannot have a situation that we've seen this pattern over and over again where, you know, new government comes in and their agenda is not Indigenous issues and then the next one is.
Metallic also says funding agreements are too often presented as a take-it-or-leave-it proposition and that more consultation is a must. She proposes a legislative framework for how governments should meet with Indigenous governments regarding funding.
It's not just the government setting out what Indigenous people have to do. It's also what they as themselves as government have to do, and I think those should be clearly enshrined in legislation.
Metallic says she hopes people take away from her testimony that the chronic underfunding of essential services for Indigenous people is not a thing of the past, and that in her eyes, it's a human rights violation.
I want people to know that this is not just because of things that happened in the past. These are things that are happening right now that are contributing to the significant poverty and the vulnerability of Indigenous women and girls.
Expert testimonies will continue here until Thursday. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Quebec City.
And we would like to hear what you have to say about this or any other story. Here's how to contact us. Send an email to news@aptn.ca, like our APTN National News Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter @APTN News, or go to our website, aptnnews.ca. A declaration against the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion was issued in Montreal today. First Nations, along with a coalition of unions, environmental, social, and citizen groups, are calling for emergency mobilization. Danielle Rochette reports.
Quebec artists and organizations are showing solidarity to those in the West who are fighting against Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. They are asking Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to reject the project.
We're saying if Trudeau's government is true about respecting First Nation, respecting Paris Climate Accord, then this project can go forward. And we'll be pushing hard to make sure that they understand that Quebec does not accept a pipeline out west that we did block, or the equivalent in Quebec, which was Energy East pipeline.
Eric Pinault from the University of Quebec in Montreal argues that there's an economic problem with the project and that we don't need new pipelines.
This project is only viable if the federal government steps in and puts money on the table. It's a $7.4 billion project, and the federal government said, well, Trudeau said, well, I'm going to back this project up. That means we could be potentially looking at a $7.4 billion public investment in the dirtiest fuel that we can produce right now on the planet, which is tar sands emissions.
Kanesatake Grand Chief Serge Otzi-Simon is part of the First Nations Treaty Alliance against tar sands expansion. He said that First Nations from east to west will be standing by BC First Nations who refused consent to the project.
Let them know that they're not alone, And if Alberta continues to threaten them economically, guess what's going to happen? We're going to start a movement here to boycott everything that says made in Alberta. Okay? We're not going to let Alberta dictate to anybody what goes on in someone else's backyard. No, never.
The signatories of the declarations invites everyone to an emergency mobilization on May 27th in downtown Montreal. Daniel Rochette, APTN National News, Montreal.
Civil liberties group calls it torture, and a former inmate says it filled him with anger. Now the federal government is being pressed to limit solitary confinement and ban it outright for people with mental illness. As Todd Lamoran reports, the Elizabeth Fry Society says even that doesn't go far enough.
Lawrence De Silva says he suffered post-traumatic stress after 587 consecutive days in solitary confinement.
It's terrible. And it causes severe damage to people who are not built to withstand.
That's why our organization is calling for a hard cap as to the number of days in which an individual can be in solitary confinement. And
that hard cap is 15 days. And that's why Cassandra Churcher of the Elizabeth Fry Society was absent from the press conference.
Decided to withdraw our support when it became clear that the members involved were only interested in abolishing solitary confinement as defined by 22, 23, or 24 hours in isolation above 15 days.
Churcher believes solitary confinement and all forms of segregation should be abolished completely.
I do not feel like the members who spoke yesterday at the press conference really addressed the scope of how CSC's practices impact particularly Indigenous women in the system.
She says even if solitary confinement were abolished, prisons will still use lockdown, mental health observation, and placement into maximum security.
All of these elements also segregate women in different ways. And that's why the conversation should be much broader, and we should be pushing the government to abolish its practice in all of its forms.
For example, Indigenous women make up 50% of all inmates in maximum security. That restricts access to programs and services, and an ability to use legislation that would allow them to serve or complete their sentences in their communities.
Unfortunately, they aren't able to access those pieces of legislation because they are overclassified in maximum security.
The federal government is appealing a BC court ruling that called solitary confinement unconstitutional. But Churcher says any outcome won't affect the over-incarceration of Indigenous people.
I do not feel like this court case, which looks at a very narrow definition of solitary confinement, will have the broad impact that's needed to address overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the long term.
The federal government has proposed Bill C-56 to curb the use of solitary confinement, but it doesn't ban it outright. Todd Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Federal Prison Service plans to introduce needle exchange programs in a bid to reduce infectious diseases among inmates. The move comes after years of pressure from prisoners and health advocates. But not everyone thinks it's a good idea. The Union of Canadian Correctional Officers has denounced the plan. They are worried about needles being used as weapons and say Corrections Canada is closing its eyes to drug trafficking in prisons. Corrections officials say safety and security of staff, the public, and inmates are important. Time for a quick break, but stick around. We're going to begin a series on ecological grief that you won't want to miss.
I'm Brittany Hobson. One Manitoba College is hitting the road and taking the classroom to First Nation communities. We'll bring you inside this mobile training lab and meet some of the students who are using it. That's coming up tonight on APTN National News.
Here's a look at Wednesday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 15 under the sun in Fredericton, -1 in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, and Cartwright, -2 in Nain. Rain, snow mix, and +1 in Sept-Îles, +7 and rain in Saguenay. Sunny skies across much of southern Ontario, 22 in Windsor and London, 20 in Sarnia. 12 in Timmins and Kapuskasing, 20 in Thunder Bay. Over to Manitoba, -3 in Churchill, 7 in Thompson and Island Lake, 24 in Gimli Harbor, 23 in Brandon, 22 in Winnipeg. In Saskatchewan, 28 in Estevan, 27 in Regina, 26 in Swift Current. Sunny skies and a high of 8 on Wednesday in Stony Rapids and Uranium City. Welcome back. Angry protester or grieving land and water protector? A researcher in Labrador who witnessed the Muskrat Falls protests in 2016 is challenging the way many Canadians understand Indigenous peoples defending their lands. APTN's Justin Brake has more in part 1 of a 2-part feature on ecological grief and the state's response. Indigenous people arrested and jailed, sometimes on the receiving end of violence, for defending their lands, waters, and way of life. The story plays out time and again. But research out of Labrador is challenging the angry protester image. Ashley Consolo is with Memorial University's Labrador Institute.
Grief can be not only incredibly painful and debilitating, but if people are supported and can come together, it can be very politically transformative. And it can bring people together in a healing way. And really that river has so much significance and it is an active, living entity.
Nunatsiavut and her original people face some of the most rapid climate warming conditions in the north. Little is known about how these changes are affecting Inuit health and identity.
Healing, very calming, very soothing.
Through her documentary, Lament for the Land, Consolo shows the Inuit are experiencing ecological grief.
Grief that's in response to a change to a beloved homeland or environment or ecosystem. So being out on the land and feeling their ancestors there and feeling those memories and suddenly being cut off from that not only cuts you off from the experience as an individual, but cuts you from that tie of ancestral connection.
When we lose a loved one, we mourn and remember. But Consolo says there are no universal ways to grieve the loss of an entire people's ancestral lands, waters, or way of life.
So people talk about sadness, being really afraid for themselves or their families because the ice is so unpredictable sometimes. So I'm here to show my solidarity to Rigolet, to the Indigenous nations of Labrador, but also to stand up for science as well.
Consolo had just begun her job as director of the Labrador Institute when protests against the Muskrat Falls hydro dam intensified.
Free Labrador!
With reservoir flooding potentially days away, scientists warned Indigenous communities downstream would be exposed to unsafe levels of methylmercury. She watched as Inuit, and settler Labradorians united against the flooding.
It wasn't fighting against, it was fighting for and feeling that commitment to all the people that had come before you and who had loved that river and wanting that love to continue forward and that access to the river to continue forward.
Consolo says the muskrat resistance reveals the potential grief holds as a catalyst for political change and challenges the belief that Indigenous land and water protectors are angry and irrational.
You hurt me! Get up. You hurt me!
Marjorie Flowers is from Rigolet and now lives in Goose Bay. She's been arrested 5 times for protesting against Muskrat Falls.
To think of that being gone, I can only think of this huge gap, this huge hole, like a void. That how can we continue to maintain or continue to call ourselves who we are when this is part of our identity? You know, that's part of my cultural identity as an Inuit woman.
Denise Cole was charged after she violated an injunction to do ceremony on the Muskrat Falls site.
Spiritually, there's a grieving that I'm having to come to terms with because I have a responsibility to this river. I have a responsibility to my ancestors. I can no longer fulfill that responsibility the way that I believe that I'm supposed to.
Mining, dams, it's destroying our food sources for Inuit women and children.
Kim Campbell-McLean spoke at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry hearings in Labrador. She was charged when she and dozens of others occupied the Muskrat Falls site in 2016.
And I would do it all over again. And I would do it every day of my life if I had to, in order to protect that for our women and our children and our culture.
In the fall of 2016, people visited the construction site to see the falls one last time.
I mean, I walked over there, carried canoes over these falls, and now you look at it, it almost makes you cry. But I guess that's life in itself, but to me it's hard. I'm sorry.
Don't kill the river. What's it gonna take? She's dying, she's suffering, suffocating with every cent that you make.
Scientists project the people of Rigolet will face up to a 1,500% increase in methylmercury exposure if soil isn't cleared from the Muskrat Falls Reservoir.
No, it's not only about a river and about the land, it's about who we are.
Rigolet elder Charlotte Wolfrey was arrested and charged after blockading the Muskrat Falls site.
When you're talking about our food supply of fish and seals and stuff like that, I mean, you're talking our existence, really. Rigolet wouldn't have been Rigolet without us eating and using seal.
Denise Cole recognizes her grief over the loss of Muskrat Falls, and the Churchill River cuts across Turtle Island.
It's not just Muskrat Falls. It's Site C, it's the Peace Valley in British Columbia, it's rivers in Manitoba, it's sacred land and spaces in Ontario. You go right across all of the, Indigenous territories that make up Canada, and they are all under threat. They are all under attack.
Yes, so I think it's that idea of anxiety about what's to come.
Consolo says the Muskrat Falls resistance also revealed something else. In Part 2, we'll look at how the police, government, and the Crown Corporation building the dam are responding to Indigenous people grieving their loss, and how the state views them as a threat to corporate profit. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Halifax. Looking forward to Part 2. Well, it's a mobile school that will ensure people don't have to leave home to continue their education. That story and more coming up after the break. Here's the rest of Wednesday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta, 17 in Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie, a rainy high of 21 for Edmonton, sunny skies, and 28 in Medicine Hat. In British Columbia, 28 in Kamloops, 27 for Penticton, 19 in Vancouver, 13 in Sandspit, Prince Rupert, and East Lake. In Yukon, 13 in Whitehorse and Mayo, where rain is on the way. To NWT, +6 under sunny skies in Fort Resolution and Yellowknife, 5 in Ray Lakes. Still below zero in Sax Harbor with a high of -7, -1 in Paulatuck. Over to Nunavut, -4 in Arviette, -5 in Whale Cove and Baker Lake, -4 in Iqaluit and Clyde River, -2 on Wednesday in Pangertown. Welcome back. For Indigenous students hoping to attend post-secondary school, it usually means having to leave their community. They also have to leave their family, friends, and support systems. But one college in Manitoba is changing that by bringing the classroom to the community. As Brittany Hobson shows us, it's also changing the lives of everyone involved.
So your toilet stub out?
Yeah.
And I want to stack right against the back end.
For the past 7 months, these students have been training for a career in plumbing. But this isn't a regular classroom. It's a mobile training lab set up in Seguin First Nation, and all the students live in the community.
The first few months was all basically just like material, plumbing and all that. Then we got into practical in December, January. And from then on, after that, just zoomed by.
There are 12 students enrolled in the program. Shania Dory is the only woman in the class. She says the decision to join a mostly male-dominated industry came with some help from her mom.
My mom is kind of into this hands-on stuff, and it kind of inspired me to do that stuff too.
The mobile lab is run by Red River College and was started as a way to provide trades training to rural and northern communities in Manitoba. For some students, like Nevin Cook, the opportunity to pursue education right in the community has allowed them a second chance at life.
Led me to jail, led me to drugs, all that. Ever since I started taking this program, I've been keeping my nose clean. I've been staying out of trouble. I'm already almost done with my probation. This program has really helped me grow.
And it's not just the students who are getting another shot.
I didn't know if I really wanted to teach again. But since I've been here, it's like a second chance for me. And that's what got me really going.
Mike Valley relocated to Manitoba last fall to teach a class. He says it's been a rewarding experience.
I built good relationship with just about everybody here. But they know they can get in touch with me. It's my students, they all know. If they want the help for any type of reason, call me.
For Cook, the feeling is mutual.
This Frenchman, just comes into the res and just showed me a different way,
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Seguin First Nation.
Great idea. A 100-year-old painting of a reclining nude woman that was once considered offensive is now sold for millions.
130 million, 132 million, $132 million now.
The Modigliani piece sold for more than $200 million Canadian at a New York auction. The artist shocked Europe at the turn of the 20th century with his series of 22 reclining nudes. If you think that's pricey, the record for the most expensive painting ever sold is Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, that sold for a whopping $575 million Canadian. And before we leave you tonight, here's a story from our Something You Don't See Everyday file. A close encounter between a bear and a hunter, trying his best to be very quiet. The hunters were in their stand near Bonnyville a few days ago when a male black bear chased a cub up the tree. One hunter sat quietly while the second filmed the encounter. The cub eventually climbed down. Ironically, the two had discussed what to do if this happened just prior to the trip. I would have preferred to be the one recording that. That's your APTN National News for this Tuesday. Be sure to tune in tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern for In Focus. We'll be discussing missing children, as May is Missing Children's Month. Now stick around. An all-new episode of The Laughing Drum with Tim Fontaine is just minutes away. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Good.